If you want wealth, you must act quickly. Bring me someone young, a child. It was a cold, quiet night in Ado Ekiti. In a dimly lit room, a young man named Solomon Fabii sat on a wooden stool, his hands trembling as he scrolled through his phone. His mind was clouded with desperation. He had nothing, no money, no future. But tonight, everything was about to change. Just a few feet away, his 7-year-old nephew, Jomaloju, sat on the floor playing with a small toy car, humming a tune, completely unaware of the danger lurking in the air. Suddenly, Solomon's phone rang. His heart pounded as he answered. A deep, mysterious voice echoed through the speaker. It was the herbalist. The voice was calm, yet persuasive. If you want wealth, you must act quickly. Bring me someone young, a child. They won't die, just suffer a little. Solomon swallowed hard, his eyes drifting toward Jomaloju. The little boy, innocent and trusting, smiled up at him. Solomon's fingers tightened into a fist. He hesitated for a moment, doubt creeping into his mind. But then he shook his head. This is my chance, he whispered to himself. My only way out. Hours later, Solomon and Jomaloju walked down a dark alley, the boy clutching his uncle's hand. The air was thick with silence. The only sound was the distant barking of stray dogs. Waiting in the shadows stood the herbalist, his eyes gleaming under the dim moonlight. He smiled darkly as they approached. Good. You followed instructions, he said. Jomaloju shivered and looked up at his uncle. Uncle, who is this man? He asked, his voice small and uncertain. Forcing a smile, Solomon knelt beside him. Just a friend. Don't worry. The herbalist took a step closer and pulled something from his robe, pretending to retrieve a mystical item. But then, in a sudden change of tone, he asked firmly, Solomon, do you truly want this? Without thinking, Solomon nodded. But before anything could happen, the silence was shattered by the loud blare of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed against the alley walls. Police officers rushed in, their guns drawn. Freeze! Hands where we can see them, one of them shouted. Solomon's eyes widened in shock. He turned to the herbalist, confused. You set me up? The herbalist smirked and shook his head. I only test the truly wicked. Solomon fell to his knees, his breath shallow as the officers grabbed him, yanking his hands behind his back. Jomaloju, now crying, ran to one of the officers bearing his face in their uniform. At the police station, Solomon sat in handcuffs, his head bowed in shame. The police spokesperson, SP Sunday Abutu, addressed the press. His voice was firm and unwavering. This should serve as a warning, he said. Desperation must never lead to evil. In the background, Jomaloju's parents held him tightly, his small arms wrapped around his mother's neck as he sobbed. Meanwhile, Solomon was led away, his dreams of riches shattered forever. Days passed, but the shock of Solomon's betrayal still hung heavy in the air. In his small cell at the police station, he sat on the cold, hard bench, his mind racing. The voices of his past mistakes echoed in his head. The promise of wealth, the temptation, the lies he told himself. But now all of it was gone. Outside, the city moved on. News of his arrest had spread like wildfire. People whispered in the markets, in the streets, in hushed voices at church. Did you hear? A man tried to use his own nephew for money rituals. The story disgusted many, and others shook their heads, wondering how greed could turn family against family. But the loudest whispers came from his own home. Jomaloju's parents, Solomon's brother and sister-in-law, were torn between anger and heartbreak. How could he do this? Jomaloju's mother, Ife, cried. He lived with us, ate at our table, held Jomaloju in his arms like a real uncle. Her husband, Kunle, clenched his jaw, staring out the window. I should have seen the signs, he muttered. He was always desperate, always looking for a shortcut. Meanwhile, Jomaloju, once a bright and playful child, had become quiet. He no longer played with his toy cars. He barely ate. At night, he woke up screaming, haunted by nightmares. In his dreams, he was back in that dark alley, his uncle whispering, "Don't worry," before handing him over to the shadows. One evening, Kunle and Ife sat together, watching their son as he stared blankly at the television. He hadn't spoken much since that night. "We need to help him," Ife whispered. "He's just a child." Kunle sighed and nodded. "I'll talk to a therapist tomorrow." But deep inside, he knew that healing would take time. At the police station, Solomon's trial was being prepared. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His confession, the video circulating online, the testimony of the herbalist who had betrayed him. There was no way out. Yet as he sat in his cell, staring at the cracked walls, he thought about something that terrified him even more than prison. The fact that, even now, a small part of him still wanted the money. And that meant he hadn't learned his lesson yet. Days turned into weeks, and Solomon remained in his cold, lonely cell, waiting for the inevitable. The trial was set to begin in a few days, and he knew there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. But what haunted him the most wasn't the fear of prison. It was the thought of facing his family again. Would his brother ever forgive him? Would Jomiloju ever look at him without fear? Would he ever be more than just the man who betrayed his own blood? Meanwhile, at home, Jomiloju's condition worsened. The once lively boy had become withdrawn, his laughter replaced with silence. No matter how much his parents tried, he barely spoke. At night, he still woke up screaming. The nightmares wouldn't let him go. One evening, Kunle sat beside his son, gently rubbing his back. "Jomi, talk to me," he pleaded. "Tell Daddy what's wrong." Jomiloju hesitated before whispering, "Uncle Solomon wanted to hurt me." His voice was small, fragile. Kunle's chest tightened. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "He's gone now. He can't hurt you anymore." Jomiloju turned to look at his father, his innocent eyes filled with something deeper than fear, something closer to betrayal. "But why, Daddy? Why did he want to do it?" Kunle had no answer. At the police station, Solomon sat across from his lawyer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes. "You understand the charges against you?" the lawyer asked. Solomon nodded, his throat dry. The lawyer sighed. "The evidence is strong. Your best chance is to plead guilty and show remorse. It might reduce your sentence." Solomon lowered his head. Remorse. He wished he could say he felt it completely, but a small, twisted part of him still ached for the wealth he had almost touched. He hated that part of himself. The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, curious onlookers, and most painfully, his own family. Solomon kept his head down, unable to meet their eyes. The prosecutor wasted no time. This man, this uncle, was willing to sacrifice an innocent child for his own selfish greed, he declared. If not for the intervention of the herbalist and the police, who knows what could have happened? Solomon clenched his fists. He wanted to scream that he never really wanted to hurt Jomiloju, that he had convinced himself the boy would be fine, just a little sick. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. Then came the moment he dreaded most. The judge turned to Kunle. "Would you like to make a statement?" Kunle stood, his face unreadable. He walked to the front, the weight of his words pressing down on him. He looked at Solomon, his brother, his blood. And for the first time, Solomon forced himself to meet his gaze. The betrayal in his brother's eyes was unbearable. Kunle took a deep breath and spoke. "Your Honor, this man is my brother," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I loved him. I trusted him. I let him live in my home, near my son, and he tried to destroy that trust for money." The courtroom was silent. "But," Kunle's voice faltered, "but I also know he wasn't always like this. He was once a good man, and I don't know if that man still exists. I don't know if he can be saved. But for my son's sake, I hope he never forgets what he did." Solomon's eyes burned with unshed tears. The judge sighed, looking down at the papers before him. "The law must take its course," he said. "The court finds the defendant guilty." A gasp rippled through the room. "Sentencing will be delivered in a week." As the gavel struck, sealing his fate, Solomon finally felt the full weight of his choices. He had lost everything: his freedom, his family, and worst of all, himself. And the worst part, he wasn't sure if he even deserved to be saved. The days leading up to his sentencing felt like slow torture. Solomon sat in his prison cell, staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying every decision that had led him here. The courtroom, his brother's words, the way Jomoloju had looked at him, afraid, betrayed. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the truth. He had done this to himself. Outside the prison walls, the world moved on. Jomoloju's nightmares hadn't stopped, and his parents struggled to bring back the joyful boy they once knew. If often found him staring blankly at nothing, lost in thought. One night, as she tucked him into bed, she whispered, "Jomi, I know what Uncle did was wrong, but don't let it take away your happiness." Jomoloju clutched his blanket tighter. "But Mommy, I keep dreaming about it. I keep hearing his voice." If stroked his hair gently. "It will take time, my love, but you are safe now, and you will always be safe." Jomoloju nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure he believed her. Back in prison, Solomon received an unexpected visitor, Kunle. As the guard led his brother into the visiting area, Solomon felt his chest tighten. He had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was happening, he was terrified. Kunle sat down, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. "You're my brother," he said quietly, "but I don't know you anymore." Solomon swallowed hard. "Kunle, Don't," Kunle interrupted. His eyes burned with emotion. "Don't say sorry. Sorry doesn't fix what you did. It doesn't erase Jomoloju's nightmares. It doesn't bring back the trust you destroyed." Solomon felt his breath hitch. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, to say he wasn't that person anymore. But was that true? Kunle leaned forward. "I came here because I need to understand. Why, Solomon? Why did you do it?" Solomon looked down at his hands, hands that had almost committed an unspeakable crime. He shook his head. "I was desperate. I was drowning, and I thought this was the only way out." Kunle exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You didn't just betray us, you betrayed yourself." Silence hung between them. Then Kunle stood up. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," he admitted, "and I don't know if Yomi will either. But I do know one thing. If you ever get out of here, you need to find a way to be better. Not for me, not for Jomi, for yourself." And with that, he turned and walked away. Solomon watched his brother go, feeling something crack deep inside him. He had already lost everything. But maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. A week later, the courtroom was packed once again. The air was heavy with anticipation as Solomon stood before the judge, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment that would decide his fate. The judge looked at him, then at the gathered crowd. He sighed deeply before speaking. "This court has considered all the evidence, the gravity of the crime, and the emotional damage inflicted on the victim," he began. "The fact that the accused was willing to sacrifice his own nephew for financial gain is both disturbing and inexcusable." Solomon swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "However," the judge continued, "the court also acknowledges that the accused was influenced by desperation and external pressures. Nevertheless, greed is not an excuse for attempting to take the innocence and safety of a child." There was silence. "The court hereby sentences Solomon Fabii to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the attempted use of a minor in ritual activities." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Some nodded in approval. Others shook their heads. Solomon's legs felt weak. 25 years. By the time he got out, he wouldn't even recognize himself. As the gavel struck, sealing his fate, he finally understood. This was not just punishment. This was the price of his choices. Moral lesson: greed destroys lives. The pursuit of wealth at any cost leads to destruction. Trust is fragile. Once broken, it may never be fully repaired. Crime has consequences. No matter the reason, wrong choices come with a price. Family should protect, not harm. Betrayal from loved ones is the deepest wound. True wealth is found in contentment. No amount of money is worth the cost of one's soul. If you found this story eye-opening, subscribe, like, comment, and share for more educative and thought-provoking content like this. Stay informed, stay aware, stay safe.